Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, the wilderness doesn't just take people. Sometimes it gets used. The ridge lines, the frozen lakes, the logging cabins buried deep in the Cascades. From the outside, they all look like isolation. And isolation, it turns out, is exactly what certain kinds of people are looking for. Tonight, we have 3 cases, and each one shows you a different version of that truth. First, a high-alpine trapping cabin in the Washington Cascades, where 3 men spent 2 months convinced something ancient was moving outside their walls at night, right up until they stopped believing anything at all. Then, a town in Oregon, trying to forget it used to be logging country, where a killer officially executed by the state in 1999 walked free due to a database error and spent 14 years designing an audit for loneliness, filing anyone who failed it. And finally, a flat basalt rock on a Washington ridge face, where 4 women's skulls were arranged face up in the ferns in 1983, and the detective who spent 23 years figuring out what kind of man brings a folding chair up a mountain to sit with the dead. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Also, YouTube tells me that only about 4% of the people who watch these videos are actually subscribed. If you're in that other 96%, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It's free, it helps more than you know, and it's the only way this channel can keep bringing you the stories most people try to bury. Now, lights down. Let's begin. Story 1. The first thing I noticed wasn't the bodies. It wasn't even the smell, though that came later. The first thing I noticed was the sound. A low, rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere above me, steady and patient, like something enormous was keeping time. Thud. 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 I stepped back from the cabin door, looked up, and saw them. Fist-sized river rocks, 6 of them, sitting on the pine-shake roof like somebody had placed them there, one by one, dark with old snowmelt, edges worn smooth, not fallen from a tree, not blown by wind, set down deliberately by a pair of human hands. I remember standing there in maybe 8 inches of crusted snow, wind off the ridgeline cutting right through my jacket, and thinking, someone wanted those men to believe something lived above them. That thought should have made the case feel simpler. It didn't. It made it worse. My name is Cord McGuire. I spent 19 years with the State Major Crimes and Cold Case Unit before I retired. And I can tell you without any hesitation that the Obsidian Basin case was the most psychologically engineered crime scene I ever walked into. Not the most violent, not the most gruesome, the most deliberate. Whoever did this wasn't just killing 3 men. They were writing a story, a monster story, and they very nearly got away with it, because the ending they wrote was so convincing that even the deputies who responded with me spent the first hour whispering about things that don't exist. I want to tell you what actually happened up there, because the truth deserves to be heard over the folklore. The call came in mid-January of 1997. Welfare check, officially. 3 contracted trappers hired by a commercial logging outfit for predator control work in the high Cascades had gone dark. 6 weeks of silence. The satellite phone bolted to the wall of their base cabin had been ringing since before Christmas, with nobody picking up. The logging company's regional manager, a nervous guy named Dale Ingram, drove up to meet us at the trailhead. He kept talking about weather delays and equipment issues, working hard to convince himself there was a normal explanation. I let him talk. I'd already stopped believing in normal explanations, The moment dispatch told me the boots were still by the door. Trappers don't leave their boots. Not in January. Not up here, where the overnight temperatures dropped hard enough to crack exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The trail into the basin was a 2-mile slog through old-growth fir and hemlock, with the last quarter-mile running along the edge of a lake the locals called Devil's Lens, a long, narrow sheet of ice that sat in a natural depression between 2 ridges, its surface pale and still. One of the deputies, a young guy named Warren Falk, kept stopping to look at it. I told him to keep moving. We forced the cabin door at just past 11 a.m. The satellite phone started ringing again almost immediately after we stepped inside, the chirping bouncing off the knotty pine walls like something mechanical had been waiting for us. The interior looked paused rather than abandoned. 3 enamel plates on the rough-hewn table, each holding the same half-eaten stew, now crusted into a dark ring where the gravy had contracted and dried. A propane stove with a pot scorched dry on the burner. A small television and VCR stacked on a milk crate in the corner, its screen frozen on the menu page of a Bigfoot documentary. America's Wild Giants, the title card read in thick yellow letters above a blurry still frame of trees. A hunting magazine splayed open on the counter to an article about Pacific Northwest Sasquatch sightings. 3 pairs of heavy Gore-Tex boots arranged in a neat row by the door, 3 coats hanging on wooden pegs above them. The rifle rack on the far wall was empty. People don't walk out into sub-zero alpine wind without boots or coats, unless they're either panicking or they trust whoever is calling them outside. I pulled on my gloves and called the scene tech team in. We worked it by the book. Digital photographs from the doorway outward, video walkthrough, swabs on the doorknobs and chairbacks for touch DNA, fingerprint powder on the satellite phone handset and the TV remote. Blood flakes on the interior door jamb went into sterile tubes. A wool cap hanging from a peg surrendered a few strands of hair. We bagged the magazine, the VHS tape, and a camo duffel found under one of the bunks, stuffed with more tapes, more Bigfoot documentaries, a Renner-taped episode of a cryptid reality show, a VHS copy of something called The Legend of Bigfoot. The back door's motion sensor light had been unscrewed. The bulb sat inside a coffee mug on the counter, right next to the stove. Whoever removed it wasn't trying to hide. They just wanted the outside of that door dark at night. That was the moment the case stopped being a welfare check and became something else entirely. Then, Falk called me outside and pointed at the roof again. I'd already noted the rocks from the front. Now I walked the perimeter, and I found boot prints in the snow. Not the men's boots, which were still inside, but someone else's. Larger, broader, with a strange spreading of the toe area that didn't match any standard tread. They circled the cabin in a loose ring, maybe 8 feet out from the walls, and then they stopped. No departure trail leading away into the tree line. No approach trail coming in. Just a circle of impossible prints, starting and ending in midair as if whatever made them had dropped from the sky. Falk exhaled slowly and didn't say anything. I crouched down and looked at the prints for a long time. Too perfect. Too deliberate. The spacing was too regular, the impression depth too uniform. Real footprints, human or animal, carry the weight of movement, deeper at the heel on a downhill slope, shallower on flat ground, asymmetric from stride to stride. These were all exactly the same depth. Someone had pressed them in by hand, or rather by a tool built to press them in. I stood up and made a note in my field book. Manufactured prints, staged entryless appearance, likely achieved via snowshoe modification or precast impression tool. I underlined the word manufactured twice, Then I went back to worrying about the missing rifles. We found the bodies 3 days later. A fish and wildlife drone running a grid search picked up the anomaly first. A rectangular patch of ice on Devil's Lens, with different thermal refraction. Warmer water beneath a weaker crust, suggesting something had altered the ice's structural integrity from below. The retrieval team went in with an ice rescue sled and a chainsaw. Cutting through the crust released a low, wet sigh of methane and cold rot that I will never entirely forget. The first shape came up on a pike pole wrapped in blue plastic tarp, plastic twine knotted in 3 places. We got it to the bank and cut the twine carefully, photographing every knot before we touched it. What was inside had been a man in his mid-50s. His face was barely recognizable as a face. Bone caved inward at the nose and orbital sockets, collapsed as if the front of his skull had been struck repeatedly with something heavy. His name, we confirmed later from dental records, was Neil Ostrowski, 54 years old, lead trapper on the contract, 22 years experience in commercial predator control. Widower, 3 adult children in Oregon. He'd come up to the basin in October and wasn't due back until spring. The second bundle came up in the same configuration: tarp, twine, weight rocks tied against the torso. Zeke Calderon, 37. Same pattern of facial destruction. The third man came up last, and he was different. No tarp, no bindings. His skin was waxy and pale from the water, but his face was entirely intact. No visible external trauma. He looked almost peaceful in that terrible, frozen way that drowning victims sometimes do. His name was Toby Haas, 21 years old, the youngest of the 3 by 16 years. Toby had only been working with Ostrowski and Calderon since September, his first real season. I remember looking at the 3 of them laid out on the bank in the gray winter light and feeling a specific kind of heaviness. Not just grief, calculation. Because already standing there in the cold, I could see the pattern in the staging. 2 wrapped, 1 free. 2 faces destroyed beyond recognition. 1 untouched. That disparity wasn't random. Somebody had a reason. The medical examiner, a meticulous woman named Dr. Hannah Eaton, called me into the morgue 2 days after the recoveries. She had the radiographs up on the light board before I even got my coat off. Under the pulverized bone of Ostrowski and Calderon, the X-rays showed round densities, distinct, unmistakable. The kind you learn to recognize in the first year of homicide. Work. Bullets. Each man had at least 1 close-range gunshot wound to the head, followed by multiple heavy blows from a blunt instrument. She suspected a framing hammer or similar, based on the striking surface area and impact geometry. Toby Haas had a different story. A single contact-range gunshot behind the right ear. No blunt trauma, no defensive wounds. Dr. Eaton set her pen down on the tray and looked at me. The hammer wasn't rage, she said. It was costume design. We recovered deformed 9mm slugs from all 3 skulls. The rifling was damaged but measurable. Ballistics would be able to work with it if we ever found the gun. I drove back up to the cabin the next morning with a scene tech named Philip Gallagher and 2 evidence recovery specialists. We needed everything digital. In 1997, that meant cloning hard drives with parallel cable rigs, imaging floppy disks, physically seizing the laptop and every storage device in the room. We cataloged the VHS tapes and mini-DV cassettes. We bagged Toby's camcorder from under his bunk. What we found on those tapes rewrote the case. The mini-DV footage spanned October through December of 1996, recorded in the weeks and months before the murders. Night footage, mostly. The camera propped on the windowsill or held unsteadily, by trembling hands, aimed up at the roof or out toward the tree line. In one clip, you can hear the rocks landing. Loud, spaced out, deliberate. Thud, thud, thud. The audio is clear. The men are awake, their voices low and strained. In another, Zeke Calderon records boot prints in the snow outside the cabin, oversized, broad, with splayed toe impressions. He zooms in with the camera, holding it steady for a long, slow pan across the length of each print. His breathing is audible, heavy, controlled, the breathing of someone working hard not to fall apart. Tracks showed up out of nowhere, he says on tape. No approach, no departure, just here. Neil Ostrowski appears briefly in another clip, standing in the cabin doorway, speaking directly to the camera. He's angry. His voice is flat and controlled, but his jaw is tight. Someone's messing with us, he says. Either that, or it ain't someone. And then there was the whistle. 3 clips across different dates captured it. A sound in the dark beyond the tree line, 3 notes, human in origin, but pitched just wrong, mimicking a bird call the way someone mimics a word in a language they don't actually speak. Close enough to fool you for a second, wrong enough to wake something cold in your chest. The psychological design of what was done to those men was visible in every frame of that footage. Whoever was staging the haunting understood 2 things very precisely: the victim's pre-existing belief system, their documented genuine obsession with Bigfoot and cryptid phenomena, and how to weaponize that belief system to create a controlled atmosphere of escalating fear. Staged sounds, staged prints, staged impacts. Anything a reasonable mind could explain away on its own, but which, stacked together, night after night, over 2 months, would begin to crack the most grounded person. Toby Haas's spiral notebooks confirmed the psychological damage from the inside. He'd been cataloging the phenomena like a field researcher, assigning dates and descriptions to each incident, with the earnest thoroughness of a young man trying to make sense of something that didn't want to make sense. He used words like territorial display and pattern recognition. He wrote about warnings and tests. The last entry before the dates went blank read, Neil says it's some nutcase. Zeke says it's a bear. I don't know anymore. Whatever it is, I can hear it thinking outside the walls. I had to set that notebook down for a minute. Back at the unit, I built a short list on the evidence wall. People who knew the men's schedule, who knew the value of their furs, who had access to the basin, who had a reason. Logging supervisors, local buyers, game wardens, one former guide who'd had a dispute with Ostrowski over a boundary line 2 seasons prior. I ran the list methodically, cross-checking against phone records, fuel logs, and the supply delivery manifest the logging company kept. One name appeared in 3 separate places. Brett Garrison, 43 years old, private contractor, registered business operating under the name Cascade Basin Supply and Excursions. He ran supply runs to remote camps in the off-season and operated Bigfoot expedition tours for paying tourists in the autumn months, nighttime hikes, campfire stories about the Ridge Walker, claims of fresh track evidence in the high basin. He had a clunky HTML website with a PayPal button and a merchandise section selling plaster track casts and T-shirts reading Obsidian Basin Wildman in block lettering above a silhouette of a bipedal figure in the trees. He'd also written extensively on online forums, early internet, dial-up era boards, the kind where people typed in all caps about interdimensional beings and forest intelligences. His posts described rock throwing and roof impacts as classic territorial behavior. He wrote in breathless, declarative sentences about how the wild men of the high Cascades He used whistled calls to lure people away from camp before an approach. He was also logged in the supply company's delivery records as the last person to visit the cabin. December 22nd. 3 days before the estimated last activity window on the victim's timestamps. We brought him in. Garrison presented as cooperative, eager even. He leaned into the interview like he'd been rehearsing it, offering theories about rival hunters, mentioning a rumored drug operation he'd supposedly heard about through back-channel sources, threading every 3 or 4 sentences with a hedge about the possibility that something else was involved. He'd clearly consumed enough true crime material to know how to pattern match to innocence. He kept using a phrase that snagged in my mind. He said the men had mocked the mountain. He said it twice, unprompted, in the same slightly rehearsed cadence. His hands had faint abrasions across the knuckles and palm pads, consistent with carrying something heavy and rough-edged over a sustained period. We got the warrants, search warrants, signed by a circuit court judge at 9 a.m. 2 days after the interview. We hit the house, the truck, and the storage unit he rented under his business name. I took Gallagher and 2 forensic techs. Garrison's attorney was on the phone before we'd been inside 10 minutes, but by then it didn't matter. In the garage, behind a stack of Rubbermaid storage bins, we found the snowshoes. They were custom-built, standard snowshoe frames with carved wooden pieces bolted to the underside of each frame, shaped and sanded into exaggerated foot forms, roughly 18 inches in length, with wide, splayed toe segments. One of the toe sections had a distinctive notch on its outer edge, a small chip in the carved wood, probably from a rock strike. The state lab called back 11 days later. The carved snowshoe feet matched the size, shape, stride pattern, and that distinctive toe-edge notch against both the snow impressions recorded on Calderon's mini-DV footage and the plaster casts our team had taken outside the cabin. Match confirmed. Hair recovered from the head of a claw hammer found in the storage unit matched Neil Ostrowski's mitochondrial DNA profile. Fibers from the tarps around both wrapped bodies matched fibers from a partial roll of blue polytarp in the bed of Garrison's truck. Partial fingerprints recovered from the victim's satellite phone handset matched Garrison's prints on file from a prior DUI arrest 4 years earlier. And ballistics sealed it. The deformed 9mm slugs from the 3 skulls. Garrison owned a registered 9mm handgun. Test fire at the state lab produced slugs with rifling characteristics and microscopic striations that matched the crime scene rounds under comparison microscopy. We confronted him with all of it. He denied everything for the first 40 minutes. Then he pivoted. He admitted to the hoaxing, the rocks on the roof, the fake prints, the whistling from the tree line. He framed it as entertainment, claimed he'd wanted to play into their documented Bigfoot obsession, and had been planning to film the results and sell the footage to a documentary producer he'd been in contact with through an online film forum. He laid it out in a reasonable, almost jovial tone, as if explaining a prank that had gotten out of hand at a party. They wanted stories, he said. I gave them stories. That's not murder. He had a second story ready for the killings themselves, claimed the men had caught him stealing fox pelts and had come at him, that what happened was self-defense, that the staging afterward was panic and poor judgment. The physical evidence said otherwise. Bullet trajectories showed that both Ostrowski and Calderon were shot from behind at close range with no hesitation pattern. Toby Haas had been shot at contact range behind the ear with no defensive wounds and no sign of any physical confrontation. There was no overturned furniture, no scattered gear, no blood spatter inside the cabin, no evidence of a struggle anywhere. This wasn't self-defense. This was execution. Our working psychological profile on Garrison, assembled with the input of a criminal behavior consultant named Audrey McYell from the university's forensic psychology department, classified him as a mission-oriented power control hybrid. He didn't just want the furs, though the financial motive was documented. Emails and fax logs showed him negotiating with a specialty furrier under a fake business name for a supply of silver fox pelts well beyond his legitimate sourcing capacity. What he wanted, beyond money, was the basin itself. He wanted to own it, to be the authority on it, to make it dangerous in a way that only he understood and controlled. The folklore wasn't just cover. It was his canvas. "What scares a man more?" he said in the interview, leaning slightly forward in the plastic chair. "A neighbor with a gun? Or something he can't explain that keeps him up every night for 2 months straight?" He never went to trial. While being transported from a pre-trial hearing the following autumn, Garrison suffered what was initially logged as a medical emergency. Toxicology later confirmed a deliberate overdose. Contraband medication, hoarded over weeks and taken all at once, he died in a hospital bed 41 hours later, his version of events untested in cross-examination, his psychology never fully exposed in a public courtroom. Forensically, the case closed. Legally, it was solved. But the stories didn't stop. The details leaked. They always do. The rocks on the roof, the fake tracks that started from nowhere, the tapes, the whistles in the dark. Town gossip absorbed those details and spun them into something that fit more comfortably than the truth. That Garrison had angered something ancient up in the basin, something that used him as a vessel and then took him as payment for the imitation. It's a better story than the real one, I'll admit that. The real one is this: a man with a dial-up internet connection, a carving knife, and a detailed working knowledge of cryptid folklore designed a psychological haunting the same way a hunter designs a trap, with patience, with knowledge of his prey's specific fears, and with complete confidence that the story already living inside his victims' heads would do most of the work for him. He was right about that. The story did the work. It kept those 3 men inside the fear he built around them when they might otherwise have left. It kept them looking up at the roof instead of watching the door. It kept the deputies whispering when they should have been processing. I still think about Toby Haas sometimes, 21 years old, writing in his notebook about territorial displays and ancient intelligences, trying to fit the shape of what was happening to him into a framework that made sense. He was cataloging his own murder. He just didn't know it. I changed my boots 3 times on that walk out from the cabin the day we found the rocks. The terrain was rough, the snow was deep, and I was already thinking about the phone records and the supply logs and the name that was going to appear in all 3 places. The basin is still there. The cabin is gone now, collapsed under a heavy snowpack in the winter of 2003, according to the county records. The lake is still called Devil's Lens. People still go up there in the summer and come back with stories about strange sounds and shapes in the trees. I've stopped trying to explain it to them. The scariest thing I ever found in that case wasn't in the woods. It was in a garage, bolted to the bottom of a pair of snowshoes, sitting behind a stack of Rubbermaid bins in the dark. Just carved wood. Just a man's hands and a man's idea of how much fear the right shape can make. That's what stays with me, not the monster. The man who understood that he didn't need to be one. Story 2. The morning I walked into that warehouse, I had been a detective for 19 years. I had worked homicides. I had worked kidnappings. I had worked cases that kept me up at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling with the lights on. I thought I had a pretty decent map of the darkness people are capable of. I thought I had seen the worst of it. I was wrong. Dispatch called it in at 6 in the morning as a possible transient homicide. That's what the first responder put in the log, transient homicide, because it was an abandoned commercial building on the edge of Millhaven's new tech corridor, a town about 2 hours outside Portland that used to be a logging community and was trying very hard to become something else. The building was a former equipment warehouse, scheduled for demolition, completely empty, or it was supposed to be. I pulled up, ducked under the tape, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that sits in a place and presses against your eardrums. My boots on that concrete floor sounded like gunshots. And then I noticed the second thing. The scene was clean. I don't mean clean like someone had mopped it. I mean there was no chaos, no overturned debris, no signs of a struggle spreading across the room, no panic written into the floor. Murder is usually messy. The act of taking someone's life against their will, it leaves evidence of the fight, the collision, the desperation. Two people's frantic energy gets embedded in a room. You can almost feel it when you walk in, like a frequency that hasn't died yet. This room had no frequency. It was still, arranged. She was lying in the center of the floor. Her name was Nora Fagan. She was 24 years old, and she had been positioned, I want you to understand that word position because it matters, on her back, with her arms at her sides, like someone had taken time to make it right. The violence done to her skull was catastrophic. I won't spend time on it. What I will tell you is that the medical examiner would later determine the weapon was a heavy, antique craftsman's hammer, the kind you'd find in an old workshop, the kind that has real weight behind it. That violence was everywhere. The care with which her body had been placed, that was everywhere, too. Those two things existing in the same scene is what kept me awake for the next 16 months. But here's what undid me. Here's what I still think about when I'm sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store and I see a job listing flyer taped to a lamppost. There was a document resting on her chest, 3 pages, crisp, clean white paper, held together with a metal binder clip. The pages were filled out in red ink, neat, careful handwriting. Not rushed, not scrawled, deliberate, like someone who took pride in legible penmanship. It was an employment application, and it was filled out in Nora's name, her real address, her real social security number, all the standard fields completed in that careful red ink. And at the bottom of page 2, in the section labeled Emergency Contacts, a single, neat horizontal line had been drawn through the box. One clean stroke of a red pen. She had left it blank. I stood over that application for a long time. My crime scene tech was waiting for me to call for it to be bagged, and I just stood there looking at that blank box. Something was wrong with me in that moment. Not professionally wrong, I mean, something cracked open in my chest. Because I had worked this job long enough to understand what that empty box meant in practical terms. It meant no one was coming to the hospital. It meant no one was going to be called. It meant that somewhere in this young woman's life, the web of connections that most people take for granted had thinned out to nothing. Someone had looked at that blank box and decided it was permission. Within 3 weeks, I would understand that this was not a single incident. Within 3 weeks, the blank emergency contacts box would become the psychological signature of a predator who didn't simply hunt people. He audited them for loneliness, the way an accountant audits a balance sheet. And if the numbers came back wrong, If the column marked Ties to the World came back empty, he filed them permanently. Nora Fagan was working 3 part-time gig economy jobs at the time of her death. 2 were through apps, 1 food delivery platform, 1 task-based handyman service. The third was a listing she had answered through a local community app called Local Grid. It was a hyper-local, completely mundane job board. The kind of platform your neighbor uses to find a dog walker. The kind of thing that feels completely safe because it's so ordinary. She had responded to an ad offering $40 an hour for a one-night estate library inventory job. Private property. Bring comfortable shoes, the ad said. Expect a quiet evening. I pulled up her message history on the app. She had exchanged 3 messages with the poster before agreeing to the job and sending him her location. Her final message to the account was sent at 9:37, the night before her body was found. It said, "On my way. See you there." No one had messaged her back after that. The account had been deactivated within 40 minutes of her last message. I subpoenaed Local Grid for the IP address associated with the account. The warrant came back in 48 hours. The IP resolved to a public library terminal 3 counties away. Our digital forensics team confirmed the account had been created from that terminal, and the ad had been posted from that terminal. Security footage at the library showed a man in a beige jacket using the terminal, but he had positioned himself just out of the camera's useful angle. All we could see was a portion of his shoulder and the back of his head. He had sat there and thought about the camera placement before he sat down. The burner email address used to register the account had been created from a coffee shop's public Wi-Fi signal 2 days before the library visit. The coffee shop footage showed the parking lot. A plain utility van sat at the far end for about 40 minutes. No one from that van entered the shop. He had used their signal from the parking lot, then driven away. He wasn't a hacker. He wasn't technically sophisticated in any remarkable way. He was something more dangerous than that. He was disciplined. He understood that in the modern age, a digital footprint is a leash, and he refused to wear one. 3 months later, she showed up. Her name was Maeve Radley. She was 28, a freelance graphic designer who had moved to the States 6 weeks earlier from the Midwest. She had 1 contact listed in her phone under Mom, but her mother lived in another state, and the 2 spoke once a week on Sunday mornings. She knew nobody locally. She had answered an ad on Local Grid for a weekend caretaker position at a model home pending sale. We found her in an unfinished subdivision on the south side of Millhaven. The framing was up on about a dozen houses, no drywall yet, no doors. She was in the shell of what would have been a living room. Same hammer trauma, same positioning, same 3-page application resting on her chest, filled out in red ink. Same deliberate line through the emergency contacts box. 2 data points make a line. I wrote that in my case notes the morning after we found Maeve. I was officially looking at a series. The break I needed didn't come from digital forensics. It came from a phone call I almost didn't take. A woman named Harriet Briggs called the tip line 6 days after Maeve's body was found. She was 31, a night shift nurse. She said she had answered a Local Grid ad about 2 months back, before Maeve after Nora, for a position inventorying vintage medical equipment at a private clinic being closed down. She said the man who met her was older, maybe late 50s or early 60s, average height, average build. Kind eyes, she said. That's what she kept coming back to. He had kind eyes, which was part of why she hadn't trusted her instincts sooner. He met her at the location. He handed her a clipboard. He offered her a bottle of water and gestured to a folding chair he had set up. And then he started asking questions. Harriet described the interview to me, and I sat there in the room with her, for over an hour going over every detail. He had asked her standard procedural things at first, her work experience, her availability, whether she had done inventory work before. And then, gradually, the question shifted. He asked if anyone knew she was there. He asked if she had a roommate who would be awake when she got home. He asked, very casually, almost as an afterthought, what he should do if she were injured on the job, who he should contact. Harriet had told him her husband was waiting in the car outside. She said she always liked to have someone nearby for late-night work calls, just as a precaution. The man had nodded. He had smiled. He had handed her $50 in cash, thanked her for her time, and told her the position had already been filled. But he appreciated her coming out. She said he was so normal about it that she had almost convinced herself the whole thing was fine. She only called the tip line because she saw a news item about Maeve's case and something about the description. The older man, the late-night job, the clipboard, made her stomach drop. I asked Harriet what the clipboard looked like. She described a metal binder clip at the top, standard letter-size pages. My crime scene tech had recovered a partial thumbprint from the metal clip of the clipboard left at Maeve's scene. I had been waiting for a match for 3 months. I pulled the AFIS results up on my monitor the morning after Harriet's interview. The system had pinged 2 days prior, and I had been chasing down the analyst who processed it because the result came back flagged with an administrative anomaly notation, which usually means a data formatting issue, a duplicate entry, something bureaucratic and boring. It was not boring. The print matched a subject named Gordon Alt. Status: deceased. Executed by state. 1999. I read that line 4 times. Nora Fagan had been murdered in 2016. The fingerprint of the man who placed that application on her chest, who positioned her body with such terrible care on that concrete floor, belonged to a man the state had put to death 17 years before she was born. I requested the physical file from the State Penitentiary Archives in Salem. It arrived sealed in a cardboard box that smelled like a storage unit. The label on the box had been typed on an old typewriter. There was a red tape seal across the top that had never been broken. I broke it. Gordon Alt, convicted 1988 in a neighboring state for the bludgeoning murders of a woman whose death bore. And this part made me feel like the floor had shifted. The same clinical, position quality as Nora's. He had been sentenced to death. He had spent 11 years on death row. The state's records showed his execution as completed in July 1999. A retired prison administrator named Dwight Sorensen agreed to meet with me. He was in his mid-70s, retired to a small house outside Salem. He poured me coffee and sat across the table from me, and when I laid out what I had found, he went very still. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, "The migration." In 1999, the same year Gordon All was supposedly executed, the state penitentiary system underwent a massive records digitization project. Paper files going back decades were being entered into the new database by contracted data entry workers. The project was underfunded, rushed, and poorly supervised. During the process, a coding error, Sorensen called it a null-byte crossover, which I've since had explained to me several ways, and I still only half understand it, caused Gordon Alt's inmate record to merge with the record of a low-level offender named Harold Beckett, who had died of a heart attack in the prison infirmary 3 months before Alt's scheduled execution date. The system recorded Alt as deceased. His physical file was sealed and archived. His actual execution, per Sorensen's recollection, and cross-referenced against the facility logs I had since obtained, was never carried out. It was marked complete in the database because the database said the inmate was already dead. Gordon Alt was not dead. Gordon Alt was sitting in a medium-security overflow cell, while the state believed it had already executed him. 3 years after the error, in 2002, a mandate to alleviate prison overcrowding resulted in an administrative review of all inmates classified as low-level offenders. Because Alt's file had been merged with Beckett's record, a shoplifter, a petty theft repeat offender, he was swept up in the review. Someone processed his paperwork. Someone walked him to the gate. Someone handed him a bus voucher and a $70 release allowance and told him to check in with his parole officer. His parole officer had been assigned to a dead man. There was no check-in. There was no follow-up. There was no social security number that flagged, no driver's license, no tax record, no paper trail that connected the living man who walked out of that facility in 2002 to the name Gordon Alt. The state had erased him, and then it handed him a bus voucher and sent him out into the world. I drove back from Salem in the dark, and I thought about that the whole way. I want you to understand something about the horror of this case. Because it's not a horror that lives in a haunted house or in a monster under the bed. It lives in a spreadsheet. It lives in a rushed data migration with no quality control. It lives in the gap between a database entry and a living human being. The system made him invisible, and then an invisible man with a hammer and an employment application went to work on the people the system had also made invisible. Predators find prey. It is depressingly consistent. But most predators are opportunistic. They wait for weakness to present itself. What made Gordon Alt different, what elevated him from predator to something I don't have a clean word for, was that he had constructed a methodology, a system, an audit. He understood the gig economy the way a surgeon understands an anatomy. He understood that it had created a population of people living in the gaps, young people with debt and no safety net, moving to new cities for work, taking whatever jobs the apps threw at them, existing in a state of perpetual hustle without the buffer of a community around them. He understood that these people were, by the economic architecture of modern life, being quietly sorted into a category that looked a lot like the one he had been sorted into by that database error. They were invisible. The system didn't really see them. And he had decided, methodically, clinically, with the patience of someone who has nothing but time, that invisibility was permission. I pulled every local grid ad we could, connect to a consistent posting pattern over an 18-month window. We identified 7 additional ads beyond the ones we had already traced. Cross-referenced against missing persons reports filed in the region during the same window, we identified 4 additional cases we believe are connected to Alt. I won't give you all the details because some of those cases are still in ongoing legal proceedings. What I can tell you is that the number of blank emergency contacts boxes we found across those cases was 4 out of 4. He tested, he interviewed, he sent home anyone who had people. He only used the hammer when the column came back empty. We had his print. We had his methodology. We had zero ability to locate him because he did not exist in any database that could be searched. No DMV, no medical records, no lease agreements, no credit history. Nothing. We had a ghost who was leaving physical evidence at crime scenes, which is a kind of paradox that I had never encountered and that our department had no protocol for. What we had was pattern and patience. My partner, a detective named Boyd Harrington, suggested we set a trap using the platform itself. The idea was straightforward but resource-intensive. We would monitor local grid for postings that matched Alt's ad profile, overnight solo work, private location, specific hourly rate range, and attempt to intercept before contact was made with a real applicant. The problem was that he posted rarely, unpredictably, and from varying public access points across a wide geographic area. We were running surveillance on his posting behavior when everything changed. A 19-year-old woman named Chloe Navarro answered an ad for an overnight security guard position at an impound lot. The posting went live at 11 at night on a Wednesday. We flagged it within 20 minutes as matching Alt's profile. By the time we had mobilized resources to the listed location, she had already been picked up. I got the call at 12:40 in the morning. A young woman had walked into a gas station on Route 9 outside Millhaven, barefoot with blood on her face and both hands, screaming for someone to call the police. The attendant on duty had her sitting behind the counter with a blanket by the time the first unit arrived. Her name was Chloe Navarro. I drove to the hospital and sat with her for 2 hours while she was treated. She had lacerations on both palms from where she had caught herself on the road. Her right knee was badly bruised. She had a gash across her left cheekbone that needed 4 stitches, and she was the sharpest, most observant young person I have ever interviewed in 19 years of police work, which is the only reason she was sitting in that hospital room and not in a sealed file box in the state archives. She told me she had gotten into the van, a retrofitted utility van, plain gray, no markings, because the man who picked her up seemed unremarkable. Older, calm, kind eyes. She described the same thing Harriet Briggs had described. Those kind eyes. He handed her the clipboard and started the interview. She answered the early questions normally, running a quick inventory in her head of whether she had told anyone where she was going. She hadn't. But as she was filling out the application, she noticed 2 things that she cataloged without reacting to, because she is the kind of person who processes threat before she shows it. The first thing, the van's back doors had no interior handles. She could see the door panel clearly from where she was sitting, and the recesses where handles would normally be were smooth, covered, modified. The second thing, on the passenger side floor of the cargo area, partly visible beneath the edge of a folded tarp, was a heavy hammer, antique-looking, with a dark wooden handle, not sitting in a toolbox, not resting in a bracket, just there, slightly apart from everything else like it had its own specific place. Alt asked her, "Does anyone know you're here tonight?" Chloe looked him in the eye and said her brother was a police officer and had her location shared on his phone. He knew exactly where she was. She told me later she had no brother. Alt went still. She watched his eyes shift, not alarm exactly, but recalculation. A spreadsheet line that wasn't adding up. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't reach for the hammer, but she could feel him weighing something. She didn't wait for him to finish weighing it. She said her hand was moving before she consciously decided to move it. She grabbed the hammer from the floor of the cargo area, reached across, grabbed the handle, and swung. She hit him across the right cheekbone and temple. He made a sound she described as surprised more than pained, and the van drifted toward the shoulder. She hit him once more. He lost control of the wheel for a moment, and she shoved the passenger door open and threw herself out. She hit the road at whatever speed the van was doing. She got up. She memorized 2 things before she ran: the vanity plate frame, a decorative chrome frame from what appeared to be an auto dealership, and a dashboard ornament sitting on the dash near the windshield. A vintage compass, brass, mounted on a small wooden base. The needle had been painted red. She ran 2 miles to that gas station, barefoot, in the dark. She ran and she didn't stop. We had the bolo out on the van within 10 minutes of receiving her description. Traffic camera coordination across 4 counties. Boyd was on the phone with Portland Metro before I was done taking Chloe's initial statement. They found the van parked behind a budget motel off a commercial strip in southeast Portland at 4 in the morning. The rear bumper had a fresh dent consistent with road impact. On the dashboard, exactly where Chloe described it, the brass compass, needle-painted red. Boyd went in with the tactical team. I was behind them, but the room was dim, 1 lamp on. A desk against the far wall with a lamp on it, and a man sitting at the desk with his back to the door. He didn't turn when we breached. He didn't flinch at the noise. He kept doing what he was doing, which was moving methodically through a stack of papers, marking things with a red pen. He was grading applications. There were dozens of them on the desk. Filled out employment applications in that same format. 3 pages, red ink, each one paper-clipped and sorted. Some had been annotated in the margins. Some had red check marks. Some had single horizontal lines drawn through the emergency contacts box. I told him to put the pen down and stand up. He put the pen down. He stood up slowly, and he turned around. And I want to be very clear about something because I think it matters for understanding who this person was. He did not look frightened. He did not look caught. He had a bruise forming on the right side of his face from where Chloe had hit him with his own hammer, and there was dried blood at his temple, and he looked at me the way someone looks at a person who has interrupted a task they intend to return to. He said, "You have a problem, detective. I'm not in the system. You can't book a dead man." He was right about one thing. The booking process was a legal nightmare that took 3 days to resolve and required the involvement of the Attorney General's office. The defense team he was assigned would later attempt to use his administrative non-existence as grounds to argue that the arrest itself was invalid. They would fail. But he wasn't wrong that the system had created a genuine problem when it erased him. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The defense argued that the state's erasure of Gordon Ault, the clerical catastrophe that had released a convicted murderer under a dead man's identity, had produced a psychotic break that removed his capacity for legal culpability. That the man who walked out of that prison in 2002 with a bus voucher and no identity was not the same man who had been convicted of murder in 1988, and that the intervening years of administrative non-existence had shattered whatever remained of his connection to consensual reality. The jury looked at the applications, all of them. The prosecution entered every application recovered from the motel room into evidence. There were 61 filled out employment applications, sorted by date, annotated, filed. Many of them were from women and men who had never been found. Some of them bore nothing in the emergency contacts box but that single red line. 61 people had sat across from him in that van with a clipboard. He had sent some of them home. He had filed the others. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts for which sufficient physical evidence existed to meet the evidentiary threshold. The judge sentenced him to life in solitary confinement. The legal designation attached to his case file, I was told by an attorney with the prosecutor's office, is retained anomaly, a classification that essentially acknowledges that the state's own records still contain the notation of his 1999 execution while simultaneously housing the living man in a concrete cell. He exists and doesn't exist at the same time. The paperwork can't reconcile it. Neither can I, if I'm being honest. I closed the physical case file 6 months after sentencing. I put it in a box and labeled it and handed it to the archives clerk and walked back to my desk and sat down. I've thought about this case almost every day since, not because of the hammer or the applications or the van with the modified doors. I think about the system. I think about the 19-year-old who ran 2 miles barefoot in the dark because she was sharp enough and fast enough and brave enough to save herself. I think about Nora Fagan, who was 24 and working 3 jobs and drowning in debt, and who, when she filled out that application in what she thought was going to be a normal gig work evening, drew a line through a box because there was no one to put in it. I think about the database migration of 1999. I think about an underfunded, rushed digitization project and a null-byte coding error and a contractor who didn't catch it, and how that single clerical mistake released a man who had been convicted of murder, armed him with invisibility, and handed him access to a world full of people who were already halfway invisible themselves. I think about how many Gordon Alts there might be in systems we haven't checked. And every time I see a help-wanted ad on a community board, or a gig app notification on someone's screen, or a job listing that offers just enough money to be worth taking a chance on, I think about the blank box next to emergency contacts, about how easily a person can fall through the cracks of a database, about how the infrastructure of modern life has sorted a generation of people into a category of quiet, dignified invisibility that predators and systems and clerical errors all treat the same way, like they don't count. I should have retired 2 years ago. I'm still here. Story 3. The weight of 4 skulls arranged face-up on a mossy rock in the Washington Cascades, and the 23 years it took one detective to finally make the matter in a courtroom. Most detectives will tell you there's a difference between a crime scene and a crime statement. A crime scene is messy, panicked. It's evidence of something that went wrong even for the person who committed it. A crime statement is different. A crime statement is deliberate. It's evidence of someone who was entirely in control, not just of what they did, but of how they wanted it remembered. In the fall of 1983, a geology survey team hiking the eastern face of Calverton Ridge, a densely forested mountain slope in Clallam County, Washington, about 31 miles northeast of the small logging town of Dunmore, found something on a flat basalt rock in a fern break 60 meters off the main trail. That wasn't a crime scene. That was a statement, and it took 23 years, 3 forensic breakthroughs, 1 near-miss conviction, and a letter sent from a prison cell to finally read it in full. My name is Jasmine Aldridge. For 21 years, I was a detective with the Washington State Patrol Major Crimes Division, and for the last 9 of those years, I ran the cold case unit out of the Olympia field office. The Calverton Ridge case was the one I carried the whole time, in my desk, in my car, in a notebook I kept at home that my husband stopped asking about after the first few years. It was the one that made me a better investigator, and the one that convinced me the most intelligent killers aren't the ones who are hardest to find. They're the ones who figure out exactly how you're looking before you start. This is the Calverton Ridge case, and this is the man who spent 15 years watching us try to find him while sitting in a chair he'd brought up the mountain. It started on a Saturday morning in October 1983. The call came in at 7 a.m. Possible human remains on Calverton Ridge. And I remember standing in my kitchen in Olympia when my radio crackled with it, coffee in one hand, still half asleep. Possible human remains. That phrase always sounds too polite for what it means. It sounds like an administrative concern. It is never an administrative concern. I drove out to Clallam County in just under 2 hours. Sergeant Ray Hubbard was already at the trailhead when I arrived, standing beside his cruiser, arms crossed, not moving. He had a stillness about him that morning that I recognized immediately. It's the stillness of someone who has already seen something they don't want to describe out loud. He told me one of the survey team had stayed on the ridge. The other two had come back down the trail at a run. The one who stayed was a 24-year-old geology field worker named June Pratt, who was doing a state environmental survey of the ridge's eastern slope. She had a clipboard in her hand when I found her. She was standing at the edge of a fern break, not moving, staring down at a flat basalt rock. On that rock, half covered in last autumn's leaf fall, was a human skull. June didn't turn when I walked up behind her. She said very quietly, "There are more." She was right. In the next 4 hours, before the forensic recovery team arrived, we found 11 additional bone fragments within a 30-meter radius of that first skull. And here's the part that stopped every technician cold when they got there. The bones were not scattered randomly. They were distributed across two very distinct spatial zones. Zone 1, the area around the basalt rock where June had been standing, contained the skull, 2 vertebrae from the upper neck, and a lower jawbone. They were clean, relatively undisturbed, and positioned in a way that I can only describe as intentional. The skull was face up, not face down, not tilted sideways. Face up, as if looking at the sky. Nothing about that arrangement was accidental. Zone 2 began roughly 40 meters downslope, where a ravine cut through a dense stand of old-growth fir. There, we found shattered long bones, pelvic fragments, ribs that had been snapped apart by animal activity, scattered across an area so wide and steep that my first honest thought was that we were never going to recover all of it. The state medical examiner, Dr. Cora Fielding, arrived at noon. She took one long look at the spatial distribution and said 4 words. "This is going to take months." She was wrong. It would take years. The forensic archaeology team from the University of Washington arrived the following Monday. They established a compass-aligned grid across the ridge face and worked it systematically, each technician moving in assigned lanes, flagging every fragment before it was photographed, measured, and bagged. They screened soil. They cataloged how plant roots had grown into the bone tissue. They mapped the animal drag patterns from the scatter, trails to figure out what had moved and when. What we found over 11 days of field recovery was this: the remains of not one person, not 2, 4. The biological profile work, determining the age, sex, and physical characteristics of individuals from their bones, took another 3 weeks in the lab. Dr. Fielding and her forensic anthropology colleague, Dr. Gregory Compton, worked from what I can only describe as a methodology of patience. They measured pelvic angles. They examined the way the cranial sutures had fused. They looked at the wear on joint surfaces. They were reading the bones the way you read the rings of a cut tree, looking for the history inside the structure. 4 distinct individuals, all female, all estimated to have been between 19 and 24 years old. But here is the thing the slope refused to tell us. The thing that would haunt this investigation for 15 years. 3 of the 4 skulls showed evidence of deliberate separation from the rest of the skeleton. Not animal scavenging, not natural decomposition. The cut patterns on the cervical bones, examined under magnification using methods that were still being standardized in 1983, were consistent with a sharp, heavy implement applied to the neck joints after death. The heads had been taken from the bodies, transported separately, placed in Zone 1, on the rock, face up, deliberately. The bodies, the arms, the legs, the torsos, the hands, had been left downslope, where the ravine and 3 years of Pacific Northwest winters had worked them into fragments. I wrote about that asymmetry in my case journal the night of the recovery. Zone 1, the faces. Zone 2, everything else. Whoever did this wanted something from the faces. The bodies were the aftermath. The faces were the point. I had no names. I had no missing persons matches. Not yet. I had 4 women reduced to bone on a cold Washington hillside, and a spatial pattern that told me something very specific about the person responsible. This was not disposal. This was not panic. This was curation. The kind of thing you do when you're not trying to hide something. You're trying to maintain it. I started cross-referencing missing persons reports. Washington State, Oregon, British Columbia, anyone female, 18 to 24, last seen in or near the Dunmore area, disappeared between 1980 and 1983. I was looking for disappearances that hadn't generated a body. I was also looking at who had access to Calverton Ridge, the logging roads, the seasonal trail permits, the forestry maintenance contracts. It took about 6 weeks for 4 names to surface. Zoe Mercier, 20 years old, a sophomore nursing student at Cascade Valley College, a small regional campus on the outskirts of Dunmore. Last seen leaving the campus library on a Wednesday evening in March 1981. Her car was found in the library parking lot, locked with her jacket folded on the front seat. She was never found. Addison Rowe, 22, a graduate student in environmental biology, reported missing by her roommate in May 1981. 2 witnesses placed her walking toward the campus library on a Friday afternoon. One of those witnesses, a junior named Felix Chandler, remembered a man near the library entrance. He described him as polite. He described his van as clean, beige or maybe tan. Hazel Sharp, 19 years old, an international exchange student from the Czech Republic, enrolled at Cascade Valley College, reported missing in September 1982. No witnesses. Her last recorded activity was a phone call to her parents from a payphone near the campus library. The call ended mid-sentence. Her parents had not stopped calling the college's international student office every year since. Brianna Lunds, 24, a part-time library assistant and night school student. Her supervisor described her as absolutely reliable, never late, never absent. She simply didn't return from her lunch break on a Tuesday in November 1982, the campus library. Her ID badge was found on the ground in the adjacent parking lot. 4 women, 3 of them directly connected to the Cascade Valley College library. 2 of them specifically last seen near or inside that library. 1 witness, 1 van, 1 description. Polite, clean, beige. I'm telling you, the word polite in a witness statement like that is the detail that sits with you. People describe the obviously frightening ones as frightening. The people who get remembered as polite, those are the ones you should be worried about. We were building toward something. But in 1983, without DNA forensics, without a confirmed match between the recovered bones and the missing persons files, I couldn't do anything with it except keep it in front of me. My supervisor put the case on what he called sustained monitoring, which means too important to close, too incomplete to prosecute. The Calverton Ridge remains when to climate-controlled storage at the state lab. The files, all 4 of them, stayed on my desk, not in the cabinet. On my desk. I didn't file them away until 2006. That was the year I retired. In 1984, I arranged a consultation with an FBI behavioral specialist named Agent Paul Thornberry, a quiet, methodical man who walked the ridge alone on the second day of his visit and came back with mud on his boots and very little to say until he sat down with my case photographs. He didn't build a profile the way you see in movies. He asked questions. He looked at the spatial evidence maps. He spent a long time with the photograph of the worn fern oval, an approximately stool-sized depression in the ferns around the Zone 1 rock, where the vegetation had been flattened by repeated pressure. He looked up at me and said something I wrote down word for word in my case journal that night. The Zone 1 placement isn't a signature, it's a relationship, he came back. More than once. Not to check if anyone had found it. To be there. That's not a man hiding something. That's a man visiting something. That framework changed everything about how I understood the case. I stopped looking for someone trying to disappear. I started looking for someone maintaining a presence, someone organized, educated, campus adjacent, someone who, in Paul's words, may have studied investigative methodology formally, not as an investigator, but as a student of it. That last line. I underlined it 3 times. I went to the Cascade Valley College registrar and requested enrollment records for male students with campus library access between 1980 and 1983. It took 8 months to get a response. The list had over 2,000 names. Over the following year, I built a short list. I was looking for men who had a pattern of library access, overlapping with at least 3 of the 4 disappearance dates. Men who had studied anything adjacent to criminology, behavioral science, psychology. Men who drove a van. Men who, after graduation, had stayed in Washington State. The list narrowed to 21, then to 11, then to 4. 3 of those 4 I was able to eliminate through alibi corroboration, employment records, or the fact that they had relocated out of state. 1 name I could not eliminate, Garrett Dubois, 26 years old at the time of the first disappearance. A graduate student in criminology at Cascade Valley College from 1980 to 1983, completing a master's degree. He had been on a graduate teaching fellowship that gave him unrestricted access to the college library at all hours. He drove a beige Econoline van registered in his name. His thesis, I tracked it down in the college library's bound dissertation collection, was titled Organized Offender Typology and Scene Management, Behavioral Indicators in Homicide Investigation. He had written his graduate dissertation on how organized killers manage their crime scenes. He had been enrolled at the college during every single one of the 4 disappearances. He had access to the library. He had the van. He had, in his own academic words, a documented understanding of how investigators look for what people like him leave behind. He graduated in 1983 and moved to Bellingham. He got a job as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm. No prior record, no complaints. His colleagues described him as exceptionally thorough, unusually calm under pressure, and, this phrase, always seemed to know what you were going to say before you said it. I had a name. I had a van. I had a timeline that fit every data point perfectly. I did not have physical evidence. I could not touch him. He knew that. 8 years passed. In August 1991, Garrett Dubois was arrested in a Bellingham motel parking lot for a violent assault on a woman who had managed to get to her car and lock herself inside before he could reach her. She survived. She had pepper spray, and she used it. He was arrested 20 minutes later, standing beside his van in the lot, hands at his sides, face entirely calm. The arresting officer wrote in his incident report, "Subject appeared unsurprised by my arrival." The detective who connected Dubois to the Calverton Ridge cold file was a young woman named Avery Stafford, who had joined the Bellingham PD Major Crimes Unit 2 years prior. She was sharp. She pulled every cold file that matched his vehicle description, his geographic footprint, and his demographic profile within a 3-state radius. She found Calverton Ridge in about 4 hours. She called me at home on a Monday evening. I drove to Bellingham that night. When I first saw Garrett Dubois across an interview table at Bellingham PD, I wrote one line of physical description in my notebook. Looks like a man waiting for a student to give a wrong answer. He had large, careful hands. He placed his coffee cup precisely in front of him, equidistant from the table edge, and adjusted it once. He watched my eyes while I read from my notes, not my hands, not my file. My eyes. Like he was tracking my reasoning. I told him why I was there. He said, "That's a cold case. Not, I don't know what you're talking about, not, what's Calverton Ridge?" He acknowledged the case's investigative status before I said a word about it. He knew it was cold, which meant he had been tracking it. I asked him how he knew that. He said, "I follow these things professionally." I think about that sentence a lot. Professionally. He had spent 8 years as a paralegal, working in legal defense, which meant he had continued to develop his understanding of how law enforcement builds, and fails to build, a prosecutable case. He had spent 8 years watching us not find him and concluding correctly for a long time that we probably never would. Then he said something he shouldn't have. He said, "The slope recovery on the eastern face. Was the fernware pattern consistent with repeated visits? I'd think that would be the detail that mattered most." He didn't ask what. "We found on the slope." He told me what we found. He described the fern oval. He told me it would be the most significant detail, as if he already knew it was, which he did, because he'd made it. He'd been sitting in that oval for years. I kept my face as neutral as I could and wrote it down. We executed a warrant on Dubois' apartment 3 days later. No trophies, not in the conventional sense. He wasn't that type. What we found was more useful and, honestly, harder to shake. In his hall closet, a small folding camp stool, well used with clay-heavy red soil caked in the feet's rubber caps. A soil geologist later confirmed the composition was consistent with the specific clay profile of Calverton Ridge's eastern face. He had brought a stool up that mountain. He had brought it to sit. He had gone back, not once, many times, enough that the ferns had worn thin, enough that the stool feet were caked with that specific, identifiable soil. We also found his personal library. 14 texts on forensic anthropology, 3 books on behavioral criminal profiling, 1 copy, heavily annotated in his own handwriting, of a published history of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. I read his margin notes later. They weren't notes of admiration. They were corrections. He had marked the passages he thought were analytically insufficient. He had graded the book. In 1993, Dr. Cora Fielding and her colleague, Dr. Compton, revisited the stored cranial remains with updated forensic odontology methods. Dental comparison is meticulous, slow work. You're measuring the precise geometry of teeth against ante-mortem X-rays, looking for a match that is as individual as a fingerprint. They confirmed 2 identifications, Zoe Mercier and Addison Rowe. After a decade of 4 unnamed women, 2 of them finally had their names back. We charged Dubois with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He declined to plea. He requested a jury trial. His defense was predictable because he had studied it. They attacked the storage chain of custody for the bone samples, almost 50 pages of motions challenging the 15-year gap between recovery and analysis. They argued that the 1983 recovery protocols were inadequate by 1993 standards. They produced an expert who testified that the cervical cut mark analysis was inconclusive. The defense attorney told a journalist later that Dubois had, at times, corrected the defense team's understanding of forensic procedure from the defendant's table. I testified for 2 days. He watched my testimony the way he had watched everything, analytically, taking notes. He never looked at the victim's photographs, not once. He looked at the scene photographs, the slope maps, the spatial diagrams. He was evaluating the quality of the investigation from the defense table, deciding whether we'd done it correctly. We had. The jury convicted on both counts, life without parole. When the verdict was read, Dubois nodded, once, slightly, like he had marked a student's paper and found the conclusion acceptable. He didn't look at me. 2 victims remained officially unconfirmed: Hazel Sharp and Brianna Lund. I kept their files on my desk. I stayed in contact with Hazel Sharp's mother, a woman named Marta, living in Brno, who had called the Cascade Valley College International Student Office every January since 1982 asking for any news. I called her once a year myself after 1993. Each time I had to tell her the same thing. Not yet. Still working. Don't stop hoping. Brianna Lund's older brother, a man named Declan, came to the Clallam County Courthouse periodically to ask about case status. He always brought a photograph. Once, in 1996, he left it on my desk without a note. It showed a woman in a graduation gown, squinting into the sun, holding a rolled certificate. She looked like someone who had plans. That photograph sat in the corner of my desk until I retired. The DNA forensic methodology that could have helped us in 1983 didn't exist then in any practical form. By 1997, mitochondrial DNA extraction from skeletal material had advanced enough that the stored bone samples from Calverton Ridge might yield results. I applied for a state forensic grant to fund the analysis. It took 14 months to approve. The process was not quick and it was not simple. The lab team, working at the University of Washington forensics facility, had to reduce small sections of tooth roots and dense cortical bone to powder using cryogenic milling. They then ran overnight chemical treatment to break down the cellular structure and release whatever genetics material had survived more than a decade in storage. The extractions were run multiple times, with control samples processed in parallel to detect any contamination. They were looking for mitochondrial DNA, not the full nuclear DNA profile most people are familiar with, but the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, which is more stable in old bone and can be matched against a living maternal relative. In 1998, while the DNA work was still ongoing, I received a letter. It was addressed to me personally, through my office at the State Patrol. The return address was the corrections facility where Dubois was serving his sentence. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. He never used the victims' names. He referred, in precise language, to the arrangements I made on the eastern face, and described the experience of returning to that location as attending to work in progress. He noted that the site had changed over the years, as the mountain does its own work, which was his way of describing what the winters and the animals and the soil had done to the remains in Zone 2. He described the return visits as attendance, in the same tone you'd use for a standing appointment. He said he visited until the arrangement became too altered to serve its purpose. He did not explain what the purpose was. I turned the letter over to the prosecutor's office. It was entered into the permanent case record. I kept a photocopy in the back of my notebook. In September 1999, Garrett Dubois died in custody. He was 44 years old. A cardiac event, He died before the DNA results came back, before I could put Hazel Sharp's name and Brianna Lund's name on a table in front of him, before Marta could watch someone answer for what happened to her daughter. He got a cardiac event. Those 4 women got the eastern face of Calverton Ridge. I went home the night I was told, sat at my kitchen table, opened my case journal, and wrote 2 words. He knew. The mitochondrial DNA confirmation for Hazel Sharp came in the spring of 2002. A lower premolar tooth root, recovered from Zone 1 in 1983, cataloged in a labeled evidence envelope that had sat untouched for 19 years, yielded a mitochondrial sequence that matched a buccal swab taken from Marta, her mother, who was 71 years old and still living in Brno. I called Marta through a translator. The call lasted 7 minutes. Afterward, I sat in my car in the parking structure for a long time and did not do anything in particular. Brianna Lund's confirmation came 2 years later, in 2004. A fragment of occipital bone from the back of the cranium, recovered from Zone 1, stored since 1983, yielded a mitochondrial sequence confirmed against a DNA sample from her brother Declan and against bone density imaging that matched an old skull X-ray from her dental file. I told Declan in person. He looked at the photograph of Brianna that he'd left on my desk in 1996. I'd kept it. I'd brought it to the meeting. And he looked at it for a long time. He said, "She deserved better than 20 years in a box in the state lab." I said, "Yes, she did." There's nothing else to say to that. The 4 identifications were entered into the official record in 2004. 2 convictions stood. Dubois had been found guilty of murdering Zoe and Addison. The case files for Hazel and Brianna were formally marked suspect deceased, no trial possible. The DNA confirmations closed the identification question. The accountability question closed when Dubois' heart stopped in a prison medical unit in 1999. I wrote the formal case closure report at my desk in Olympia on a Tuesday morning with Brianna Lund's graduation photograph in front of me. I wrote the last line of the report. Then I opened my personal case journal to the final entry. He knew. And below it I wrote, "They know now too." Then I mailed Brianna's photograph back to Declan in a manila envelope with a handwritten note that said, "We got it right in the end. I'm sorry it took us this long." People ask me if the Calverton Ridge case gave me closure. Closure is a word that belongs somewhere else, not in an investigator's vocabulary. What I have instead is a case file that is fully labeled. 4 names on 4 identifications, 1 conviction, 1 man who died, knowing we had confirmed 2 of them, and couldn't make him answer for the other 2 in a courtroom. He probably considered that a partial victory. I don't. But the thing I can't put down, even now, years after I retired, years after I last drove out to Clallam County, is the stool. Not the skulls arranged face up on the basalt rock. Not the letter with its precise, controlled language. Not the thesis he wrote about organized offenders while he was one. The stool. Because the skulls tell you something happened. The letter tells you he was proud of it. But the stool tells you something else entirely. The stool tells you he looked forward to going back. He planned for comfort. He brought something to sit on. He settled in. He stayed until the light changed. That is not something I know how to explain to someone who hasn't spent 20 years reading the evidence of what a person is capable of organizing around. It's not something I wanted to understand. But I do understand it now, and I think about it every time I'm in the woods, every time a trail goes quiet around me, every time I notice that the birds in a particular patch of forest have stopped making noise. Calverton Ridge doesn't feel haunted. It feels used, like a room someone lived in for a long time and then left, with all the furniture still in place. Who does that? What kind of person brings a folding stool to a mountain and sits with the dead season after season for years? I don't have an answer. I have a conviction, a letter, a soil sample, and a case journal full of things I still haven't been able to set down. That will have to be enough.